One of the things that I now find in Australia going round, and I'm doing this almost constantly, is a tremendous disillusionment with the whole political system, and particularly the voting mechanism, and whether we're getting the sort of choices that we want at election time. And that seems to me to be a tragedy, because the voting system is an integral part of our democratic process, and it's supposed to be the means whereby ordinary people have some sort of input into what government they're going to get, and also what policies they're going to get. And if the community, or at least part of the community, no longer feels that is happening, well, there's something gone wrong. And this is not peculiar to Australia. You can find it in America or Canada or New Zealand, where there is quite a bit of reluctance about the whole business of going to voting booths and making marks on bits of paper. And if we don't get that right, it's quite conceivable that there will be so much cynicism and lack of enthusiasm that choice in the democratic process becomes less and less obvious until it really doesn't exist. Perhaps the only honest people that I find are young people who in many cases, sadly, don't register to vote today. They don't honestly feel that it makes any difference, and of course their parents tend to get somewhat irate with them and say, well, of course, you're the young people who are coming up in this country, you ought to vote, it's your country, you've got to have some input. So their children say to their mothers and fathers, well, do you really think it makes any difference? And mum and dad scratch their heads and quite often say, well, I don't think it does really. At which the kids laugh and walk off, because what is the point in going through a sort of ritual if you don't think it makes much difference? If you do think it makes a lot of difference, for goodness sake, do it. But it's quite apparent that a lot of people don't feel like that. So broadly what happens now is that once every 3 years in the federal sphere, and roughly that for state governments, we go on a set day to voting booths right across the country and walk through a gate where people are thrusting bits of paper on how to vote at us, most of which end up in rubbish bins, it seems to me. And then we go in and get our name crossed off a roll, because if we don't do that, we're going to get fined for not attending. And we're one of the very few countries in the world that do not have voluntary voting. We're compelled to do it. And then having done that, we are given a piece of paper with a list of names on, and sometimes in the Senate elections there are scores of names, and we go into a box and we have a pencil that we're supposed to mark our preferences in. Now, if you actually gave each voter a list of photographs, or a number of photographs to go next to the appropriate name, I would say about 98% would not get it right, because they're not people we know. Occasionally they are. And so we are voting not so much for policies, but for people whose policies we're not sure that we really necessarily understand. And so if you try and analyze the motive from which a lot of people vote today, on the whole, they try and work out which one's going to do the least damage. And they put that one last, if they can work it out, and then they work back from that, and they're left with, finally, somebody you've got to put number one that you're not too enthusiastic about. And you fold that up and put it in a box and go away and hope you haven't got to do that for another 3 years. Now, if that's all that's left of this marvelous idea of government of the people, by the people, and for the people, a mechanism that is there to serve people and to reflect their desires and their policies and their concerns, something has gone drastically wrong. We have all the mechanisms of a democratic government, but it really isn't too democratic. Now, this was brought home to me very strongly about 3 days before I came across to Western Australia, when I was speaking in central Queensland in Mackay. We had a huge audience. We had about 600 people that night. And included in the audience was the federal member of parliament. And I must confess I was not very kind to politicians that night. I said what I thought. And I met him afterwards and talked to him and thought he might feel a little bit of umbrage, but I was really surprised when he said, well, I've heard what you've said, and I've heard 1 or 2 of your tapes, and I want to tell you that it's much worse than you think it is. I said, what on earth do you mean? Well, he said, we have a parliament which is only a name now. It is simply a mechanism for ramming bills through that have very little debate. And he pointed out that they had had one very brief period where they had put 22 bills through without any debate or notice that they were going to go through. And he said if there's any connection between that and the time-honored idea of consideration and debate and analysis and all the rest of it, he said, I can't see it. So we're in a very dangerous situation. Now, you can find that everywhere. You can find it in America, where they had an election last year that went for 12 months. It was simply an election about two individuals, and which one, and for briefly, a third one came in, which one would become the leader of the most powerful nation on earth, probably the most powerful nation in the whole of human history. And so for 12 months, Bill Clinton and George Bush belted each other up and down the United States, and the election cost literally millions and millions of dollars. The total bill at the end was over $50 million. And by and large, it was simply a contest in mud throwing. There was very little of substance that went on, and it was exaggerated, as it always is, by a media that lives now and breeds on sensation. So, for example, we had a question about whether Bill Clinton had been a drug addict at one stage and whether he'd actually smoked pot when he was young. And then they ran a program on if he had done it, had he inhaled or not. And that apparently made some sort of difference. And then they went from there on to had he had a girlfriend on the side and how many illicit affairs that he had. And a young lady was found who claimed to have lived in an adulterous relationship for a number of years with Bill Clinton, and that just hit the media like Days of Our Lives and was played over and over and over again as if it had anything to do with running the nation. And then Bill Clinton was trying to drag up some stuff on George Bush, and there was a scandal about whether he'd been involved in the Iran-Contra arms scandal, and then they discovered he might have had an affair on the side. And so this sort of election, which was just froth and bubble and sleaze, went for 12 months. And finally, with a sigh of relief, the United States came to Election Day, and Bill Clinton edged ahead and got into the White House. But if you look at the figures, he got in with 38% of the vote. And there hasn't been a president who's had more than 50% of the vote for over 60 years now. The reason being that they don't have compulsory voting, and a lot of people don't go and vote, so it's always a minority. And then, having done that, Bill Clinton had to do what he'd carefully avoided doing through most of the election, which was to look at the reality of America's position and open the books and see the true situation. And he found, to his horror, that the government he was going to represent, the federal government, which is only one of scores of government in America, had a debt of $4.2 trillion. Well, you know, we're so used to these sort of figures being thrown around that nobody's quite sure what the difference between a million or a billion or a trillion is anyhow. And is it the sort of thing that you should be worried about? And perhaps you could get it in the Guinness Book of Records, but apart from that, what difference does it make? Well, there is an awful difference. To try and give you the difference between a million and a trillion, let's say that you owed America's debt in millions. Washington's debt is $4.2 trillion. Let's say you were trying to pay off $4.2 million at $100 a second. It would take you 12 hours to pay that bill. 12 hours at $100 a second would pay off $4.2 million. You want to pay off $4.2 trillion at the same rate, $100 a second, it would take you 1,360 years. That's the difference between a million and a trillion, or 4.2 million and 4.2 trillion. Now, there is no way that is ever going to be paid off, because during the 12 months of the election campaign that was run for the presidency, that debt increased at the rate of $1 million a second, right through the whole period. So, a president who really wanted to arrange a totally new situation and took the nation into his confidence would be desperate to get the truth of that situation through. And about the first thing he would do is to go on television and make a statement in which he said, "I have been asked to take over an economic situation which is now totally impossible." And I think this needs to be driven home, because I'm not going to delude anybody. So I'm going to do a balance sheet, like an ordinary company that's trying to do its tax return, of the whole of the United States, which will go to every shareholder. Every taxpayer, man and woman, will get a copy of this thing so that you know and I know where we stand. And if you can't read a balance sheet, we've got a way of demonstrating the reality. We're going to have a number of collectors go out every Monday morning and knock on every home in America and simply put their hands out for your share of the interest on this debt that Washington runs, which is now $3 a day for every living person. So how many people in your home? A mother and father and 2 kids? That's $12 a day, please. That's $84 a week. Cash now, and we'll be back next Monday for another 84 and another 84. How long do you think it would last? My own opinion is it would last no longer than a fortnight, by which time so many collectors would have been shot or strangled or battered to death with saucepans or rolling pins, that the nation would pour into the streets and demand to know what had happened. Because having raided the kids' piggy banks and collected all the cash out of your pocket and arranged to produce this $84, as it was handed across, every mother or father would say, "Well, look, I'm only giving you this on the condition that I never see your face again." To which the reply would be, "I'm awfully sorry, but we're going to be coming back every week from now on." Well, how long then? Forever. Because not 1 cent of it is paying off the debt, it's only paying the interest. And in the meantime, we're borrowing more money to pay the promises that we made. You see, Clinton's budget shows that out of what he is now taking in taxes, 62 cents out of every dollar is simply spent in debt service. See, there's no way he can honor what promises he made, which were broadly, we're not going to have any tax increases, we're going to try and revive middle America, that is the middle class and particularly small industry, and we're going to get the American dream going again, which is all right if you're going to do it. But of course, he can't do it. So the whole game, instead of taking the nation into your confidence, is to hide this in a way so that nobody can put their finger on what is wrong, except that there's always a cost structure that is gradually advancing ahead of what you've got in your pocket to meet it. And that in turn drives a wedge into any nation that tries to operate this, that splits it into 2 groups. And those 2 groups consist firstly of a small number of people who are big enough and have got enough economic muscle to ride ahead of this tidal wave and keep on top of it, which means they've got to get more ruthless, more efficient, attend more seminars on business management, and are pulverizing themselves. And they've got to pass their bit of the burden on to somebody behind them. And they are gradually being reduced in number. It's becoming a monopoly game to ride ahead of this thing. But the other section, by far the biggest and growing the whole time, are those who have slipped below the plimsoll line, if you want to put it that way, and are gradually slipping backwards. The families are harder to keep together, the businesses are harder to make some sort of profit at the end of the year, and finally you recede right down into a level of poverty in America which so far we have not seen in Australia, but which is there and is beginning to happen. In America, you can find in many areas the shanty towns that you would find in Soweto and Somalia and Bangladesh. The cameras don't focus on them because that's hidden now. But they're there, the battered, broken down, leaking caravans and corrugated iron shacks and the cardboard villages with no power and no water, and you can find hundreds of beggars on the streets. And that in turn can then become the danger of what is happening in Los Angeles, which at a given moment and over the most unexpected of things can explode into chaos. And when that happens, you suddenly realize that seething in a city like Los Angeles is all the potential of a Vietnam War. It's not just a few people bursting into the streets. There are fully automatic weapons, organized gangs, there's been pre-planning, and the thing just erupts as millions of dollars worth of damage is done and life is lost, and they reckon there are at least 50 potential Los Angeles that could blow in America. So it's a sad and sorry story. And Bill Clinton, instead of really facing it and perhaps creating an environment where the sheer honesty of what he said brought the nation on side, did the disappearing act which every politician does. Got into office, disappeared for 10 days down into a bunker, and then came out and he shook his head like they always do and said, the figures are much worse than I thought they were. And I'm very sorry about this, and that means we can't honor the promises we made. And we know you'll understand, and we're going to have another range of tax increases, and it's not going to be as easy as I thought. And people just raise their eyes and say, well, here we go again. I mean, you could never believe them anyhow. Or you can go and have a look at the cities in America. New York, which has been broke twice and had its debts reconstructed on the ground that you just wind back the infrastructure that keeps the city running. The fire service is just a skeleton service. The police now can't control crime. The roads aren't repaired. The pavements aren't repaired. And it is really a city that is gradually breaking up. Or you can have a look at Philadelphia, which is technically bankrupt this year. Or you can go and have a look at the states, some of which are better than others. But in the worst scenario, California, which is the 7th biggest economy in the world, they haven't paid their staff and their public servants and their contractors for well over 16 months now. All you get in your pay packet is an IOU from the Californian government, which says, when we have some money, we'll pay you. So people take these IOUs to the bank and say, look, it is government guaranteed. Would you let me have some cash until the government makes it up? And for a while, the banks went along with this, but now they're jacking up. So coming out into this situation is a new futures market, a trade in IOUs. And if you've got 1,000 worth of IOUs, you might go to your grocer and say, now look, I don't know whether they're going to come good or not. Would you give me $500 worth of groceries and take a punt on it? And the grocer doesn't know whether to risk it or not. Because what happens if the government doesn't pay? They've got over $3 billion in IOUs floating around California at the moment. This is a nation that is going to recover and lead the world. But don't think that it's any better than us, because you can find the same scenario in Britain, where 40,000 businesses collapsed last year. 40,000. Or Canada, where the International Monetary Fund has now made its first moves because their debts are so much worse than ours are. But have a look at Australia. Have a look at the state of Victoria, which had an election last year at the same time that Clinton was having his in October. And out went a Labour government that had wrecked the place. They had managed to drive up Victoria's debts to the point they represented $15,000 per head of population. $60,000 for the average mother and father and 2 kids. Scandal after scandal. In August 1991, Joan Kerner, the former premier, the Labour premier, had tried to counter this by bumping up taxes and was met with an almost statewide protest from industry. There's the headline that came out in the Australian: Kerner's taxes, a killer blow to business. And it reads, Victorian business groups presented a united front yesterday against the state government's budget, warning the increased taxes and charges would lead to companies moving interstate and thousands of redundancies. Oh no, you're exaggerating, said Joan Kerner. We've got to have tax increases to satisfy the money lenders. And she ended up with $500 million less in revenue than before the tax increases went on. Because the new taxes didn't bring in more money, they just knocked over more taxpayers. More industries bit the dust, more people were put on the dole queue, more farmers ended up in Queer Street. And tonight, as we are talking here, there's an average of 2,000 Victorian families a week moving up to Queensland. In a sense, they're economic refugees. So in came Jeff Kennett with a big majority and a number of promises. We're not going to increase taxes. We're going to run a tight ship and a responsible government and see if we can get Victoria going again. And no sooner was he in office than he went down in the bunker, where there must have been a mobile phone, and he got on the phone to Bill Clinton. What is it I do? Yes, 10 days. And he came out 10 days later and shook his head, and they do it in exactly the same fashion, and said the figures are much worse than I thought they were. Why he said that, I don't know, because they were all out. They'd all been published. We're going to have a range of new tax increases. So on went a new levy on every home in Victoria. They were going to sack 18,000 public servants, which was supposed to be an economy measure, until they found that they had to borrow huge sums to actually sack them. 2.9 billion to pay their superannuation, which went on to the debt that Joan Kerner couldn't pay. They had to close down schools and do a whole range of things they said they weren't going to do. Cut down health services, cut down all the rest of it. And even that was not going to balance the budget. So they then did what every government in Australia is now doing. They go through what they've got on the asset book and see if they can flog it off. And there's a lovely word to hide the reality of this, which is called privatization. You privatize everything. You sell the power stations, and you sell the waterworks, and you sell the transport systems, and you sell other utilities, and you say to the people, this is a good free enterprise return to private industry. It's nothing of the sort. It is a pawnbroker's sale to overseas ownership, because Australians haven't got the money to invest in that. So you find absurdities now. You go to Victoria, which has been there 200 years, and you jump on a tram in the city, which has been there 100, and the trams are no longer owned by Victoria or Australia, they're foreign owned. They were sold and the government leases them back off the foreign owner. You go to the railways, all the rolling stock on the railways is foreign owned. It's no longer Australian owned stuff. You lease that back. I was filming in Kangaroo Island over in South Australia just over Christmas. The ferry that takes you across there is foreign owned. It's the only means of communication they've got, apart from an aeroplane. But all their produce has to come across. It's owned by Malaysia. They're selling the prisons, for goodness sake. Who would buy a prison? Your government here is trying to privatize the prison. It's supposed to be very advanced and modern, and this is a marvelous idea. And people think, well, if they say so, I suppose this must be the reality. But if you want to know where privatized prisons end up, go and have a look where they've done it, the United States. A man came out of the Soviet Union back in the 70s called Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had spent 8.5 years in a slave labor camp in the Gulag archipelago in the Soviet Union. The Gulags were the prison camps, which at one stage housed 12 million people in gruesome conditions. You can find those camps beginning to appear in America. 100 huge, great prison complexes, and they really are massive. And next to each one, there is a vast multinational factory now. And you simply use the labor as wage-free, I don't know what you like to call it, slave labor in the factory, turning out a whole range of consumer goods which crush the little private industries outside that are trying to deal with the normal wage structure. There was a prisoner in America who wrote a book in the prison cell of his own experiences. I happen to have met him because he was in Australia earlier, and the causes of his incarceration were scandalous. Be that as it may, he found himself doing 10 hours a day in a multinational factory, just being marched out and producing a whole range of goods which appeared in shops throughout the nation later on. And he wrote this book, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, 22 cents an hour is what they got paid. Smuggled the book out and got it printed, and he got an extra 6 months for daring to write it. So they're not keen to rehabilitate prisoners. They're keen, obviously, to have bigger and bigger prison inmate cells or populations. And that is a very dangerous precedent. If you start making a profit out of the sentences of people who may have been in there for a dozen and one pressure reasons, it's a precedent that I think is, in the end, got the potential to turn your society into something very nasty indeed. Anyway, that's what Jeff Kennett did. But it still didn't balance the books, so he goes to Canberra and he says to Mr. Keating, would you give me permission to go and borrow some more money? We can't balance the books. And they've got to have permission under the global lending limits. And yes, away you go. So he went to Zurich, and then he went to the London money market and then to Wall Street and put together a package of new loans, which he came back with, over $3 billion, which were tacked onto the end of what Joan Kerner couldn't pay. And this tight ship called the Victorian government under Jeff Kennett, now has a total debt of $70 billion. It was $61 billion when they got in. There it is. This came out last month. Kennett to reveal $70 billion state debt. That's a $9 billion increase in 8 months by the government that was going to rectify the situation. So if you're going to operate rules where everybody lives simply by borrowing, it doesn't matter which mob is in there, that's what you're going to get. And then you go from there to have a look at the federal situation, which I think most people who've got an understanding now is in a very dangerous situation. All Australians know about our foreign debt, which has gone through the roof as we've closed down our own industries. But if you want to get a bird's eye view of the whole thing, the Department of Statistics has just put out the latest debt figures for the whole of Australia. Our federal debts, our state debts, our semi and local council debts, our foreign debts, our private and financial debts, add the whole lot up, and at the end of 1992, $723 billion. That works out at $42,500 for every living Australian, or $170,000 for the average mother and father and 2 kids. $170,000 for the average family of 4. But that was last year. It's now estimated it will go to $765 billion this year, which takes us up to damn near $200,000 for every family in the nation. Where does it end? It's now conceded by the federal government that they cannot balance the budget this year, so they're going to run a budget deficit of anything up to $18 billion. Now, what does that mean? It means that all the taxes come into Canberra, which are now about $26,000 for every family. That's direct and indirect. And the government says that's not enough, we need more. So we're going to create a budget deficit of $1,000 for every person. And we will fund that later on by simply asking the moneylenders to put the money in. And the Australian people will pay for that in next year's tax or the year after or whatever. They don't ask us if it's okay. They don't ask you, and every government that ever borrows money does this. It says in essence to those that create and lend the money, we want the debt and the bill will be paid by the people. And if they don't pay, we will throw them out of their homes or their businesses, and we will tax it into their payments or their rates or whatever it happens to be. They don't go and ask the people, is it okay if we put on your property what is in essence another mortgage? You are the guarantor of the debt that we are paying. So you don't get consulted about this until all of a sudden your taxes and your rates and all those other costs have gone up to the point where you can't keep your home or your business or whatever it is, and then they tell you that you're inefficient and it's time you got out. Now we've got to rethink this thing, particularly in a country like Australia, which has got so much going for it. Because you see, it's very easy when that type of pressure, like it is in America, is on the community, for everybody to think it's somebody else's fault. Everybody's getting slaughtered. And so the wage earner thinks it's the boss, and the boss thinks it's the wage earner, and if it's not them, it's the farmer, and if it's not them, it's too many women in business, or you've got the ingredients for genuine conflict, which is played the whole time. And parties now come in and say, well, look, I represent this group against that group. It becomes totally divisive and destroys the one thing a nation needs to come through this, which is a unity and a bond and a spirit, which we used to call the Digger spirit. So that's where we are, and finally we've got to ask some of the questions which I think we've been carefully evading for so long. And one of the men who's begun to present the real truth of what is happening is a man who I think is a courageous journalist, Santa Maria, who writes every week in the Weekend Australian. And at the end of last year, he pointed out that we were now facing an issue which many other nations in the third world have faced. He said, we're going to hear this slogan ringing through. It's called Debt for Equity Swaps. And what basically happens is that a very small group of moneylenders are now going to nation after nation and saying, pay your debts. I mean, you haven't paid, you're behind, you're in arrears, we've been lending you money to pay the interest on what you owed, this can't go on, pay your debts. And the nations say we can't pay, we haven't got a hope. Well, we'll have your motor car company, and we'll have your mineral deposits, and we'll have your electricity commission and your telephone company, and we'll also have your heritage areas while we're about it. And the governments are aghast. They say, you can't just walk in and take our assets like that. Who do you think you are? And the bankers, naturally enough, say, well, you pay your debts or else. What do you suggest instead? So the whole of the third world has been carved up under this. And few people notice that in the last 10 years, the third world nations have repaid to the Western world, or to the industrial nations, a sum of money that is equivalent to 6 times the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe at the end of the war. And they've destroyed themselves. They cut their forests down, they deplete their resources, and we then have to send troops to try and deal with what's happening in Somalia or Angola or Mozambique or the Sudan or Bangladesh or wherever it happens to be. Instead of building up their economies, we've destroyed them through the most insane financial policies. And thank goodness a few people are speaking out. If any of you've heard Susan George from the Institute of International Economics speaking on this, she is a most courageous woman. She is battling, and destroying the reputation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which should have been done 10 years ago. It's absolutely monstrous what they've been doing. Well, Santa Maria says it's about to happen to Australia. And he asked in his article right at the end of the year, there seems to be a strange logic in the process to describe the conduct of New York investment houses in forcing money down the throats of poor simpleton nations like Australia. At the end of the day, who finished up with the title to the real assets? Are we really to believe that the world's most acute financial minds have finished up in the highly advantageous position of exchanging book entries for real assets by the purest accident without a modicum of pre-planning? Somehow it's hard to believe. To believe that these vast sums, escalating astronomically through compound interest, will ever be repaid is the purest fantasy. But while they remain on the books, they furnish a useful formula for the transfer of real assets, public utilities of every type from debtors to creditors. Why don't we stop kidding ourselves? Accept that compound interest or usury is the heart of the worldwide problem, and that unless we can devise a financial system on a new and different basis, we are all equally lost. Unless we can devise a financial system on a new and different basis, we're all equally lost. And the crazy thing is, we did it once in Australia. And if you go back almost 100 years to the time this nation was born, we had a federal member of parliament representing West Tasmania who told us the way to do it. Because he'd been a banker in America. His name was O'Malley. And O'Malley said to the Australian people, never let your nation get into international indebtedness or you'll lose it. And the way you avoid that is to run your own banking system under the control of the people. You need a people's bank. And it took him 10 years to convince the same Labour Party that Paul Keating's in that it could be done. And that's how the Commonwealth Bank was formed in 1911, opening for business in 1913 in a little building in Collins Street in Melbourne that had £10,000 in the kitty. And within a few months, that bank was able to finance Australia's First World War effort to the tune of £350 million, which we were on then, at 0.5% interest rates. This is not fantasy, this is our history. And it was so dramatic that at the end of that war, the governor, Sir Denison Miller, was asked, how did you do it? And he said, I simply used the People's Bank. What was the limit? He said the limit was what the Australian people could do. What does that mean? Well, he said, if we wanted to build a ship, we asked questions like, have we got enough steel? Yes. Have we got a dry docks to build it in? Yes. Have we got engineers? Yes. Have we got welders? Yes. Have we got a crew to put on that ship when we build it? Yes. Right, we'll release the finance. And they said to him, could you do that in peace? And he said, of course I could. What's the limit? He said, there's no difference except that instead of building warships, we might be building ships for peace. We might be building local community assets. We might be simply reducing taxes so that people can survive instead of being crushed. Where do you get the money? He said, I create it. Oh, you can't create money. All economists know that. That's the road to ruin. It's the road to the banana republic. He said, well, that's very interesting. And he pulled a £5 note out and showed it to them and said, would you agree that this £5 note came off a printing press? And after a long, long time, they had to confess that it probably had. He said, the only question is whether the printing press is inside Australia owned by us or outside Australia owned by somebody who's going to put us into debt for the rest of eternity. He said we could do it. And tragically, we lost that bank in 1924 when we simply capitulated and handed that power across to a private monopoly. I was going through a second-hand bookshop just the other day, and I came across this book, Oil in Troubled Waters. The author is a man called Jim Cairns. Ever heard of that? Opened it up, and Dr. Jim Cairns, it told me, was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia and Treasurer. So he knew something about all this, and I flipped through the book, and there was a chapter called Where Does the Money Come From? And I got even more interested, and I went through this, and I discovered that this is what he'd said. Not only have the banks power to create money within wide limits, but they do so. As well as determining the total volume of money, the banks decide also to whom they will lend. It's obvious they will prefer rich and powerful people and the companies associated with them. They will not be too keen to lend to poorer people, to battlers, or to persons or even companies who may be competitive with their interests. The power to create money and to decide who should get it is a vast and significant social and economic power, and for this reason the Labour movement has always believed it should not be a privately owned power, but be exercised solely by a public or people's bank. Now, he was the treasurer in the same party as the present Prime Minister, who became treasurer later on, who campaigned prior to the election in '83 that got the Hawke government in, with this promise: we will never let the foreign banks into Australia. And shortly afterwards, he opened the doors and let 17 new banks in, and was taken overseas and made the International Treasurer of the Year. And from there on, our debts have taken us to the point of catastrophe. Catastrophe. So we need to think through our position very carefully, because we've still got the means to break out of this if we've got the spirit to do so. If we haven't, there is a time coming, and I don't think it's very far away, it might even be 5 or 6 years, where our children say to us, Dad or Mum, is it true there was a time in Australia when the people actually owned their own homes and their own businesses and they had equity in the country? And Mum and Dad might say, well, yes, actually it's hard to believe there was a time when that was the position in Australia. How did we lose it? Well, we got so indebted we had to flog the whole thing to pay the money lenders. And Dad, when that time came, what did you do about it? And Dad says, well, perhaps I should have done something, but you know, I didn't realize really what was happening until it was too late, because there was footy on television, and I never really got as far as turning it off. And they will curse our names because we didn't fight at the time we had a chance to do it. So in the middle of this point of destiny for Australia, we have this tremendous diversion, which is going to make things much worse, that we ought to become a republic. That's going to fix it up. Now, I'm going to deal with that question because I think it's very important, but I just want to start you thinking by asking this simple query. Let's suppose we become a republic. Whose head are we going to have on our money system? Whose head would we have on our coins?
King Paul.
Would it be President Keating? Or President Gough Whitlam? Or President Malcolm Fraser? Or perhaps Edna Everage? What about Rodney Roode? There'd be a tremendous president. And I would suggest to you it will not be an Australian head on our money. It will be something connected into the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or probably the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, which would be dominated by the yen, and probably the yen would be the currency in this country. And if you find that hard to believe, go to the state where I live, Queensland, and go to Cairns or the Gold Coast, and you will find there are shops and hotels there now which will not accept Australian money. And all the tourists who come in are issued with special tourist money which must be spent in Japanese-owned businesses and shops. And you'll see them going through these areas, and if they look like going into an Australian shop, they're herded out by the guide and can only spend their tourist money in Japanese-owned businesses. And if an Australian wanders into that hotel with a $20 or $50 note, it's not accepted because it's not regarded as the rightful currency in those areas. You tell me what benefit that is to Australia. So this is a very big question. And what I'm going to do is to go through a chart which is basically dealing with the whole argument over a republic and what it means, because we used to use this material to teach our kids right back in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and they knew what it was on about. They don't learn that material today.